Hello, everyone, and welcome to American Thought Leaders Now, our new spin-off of the American Thought Leaders program. Today we have comedian and freedom lover, JP Sears. JP, you've really made me think recently, and I have this quote from you here. You said that communism works like a charm 100% of the time. And I thought to myself, yeah, that sounds right. Tell me about this.
Well, first off, I apologize that I made you think recently. That's obviously a danger. The New York Times, very earnest journalism. They've reported on the dangers of free thinking, critical thinking. So I apologize for that literal violence of you thinking for yourself. The idea that living in a dangerous democracy like we have, it's an outdated paradigm, and the more communism, the better, because it'll definitely work this time because we said so. But the most important part, thank you for asking, is as we're installing communism, we don't call it communism. We call it equity. So now we know. Those are, by the way, those are the correct thoughts to think.
There's another term that you've been brandishing about, and I find it very, very difficult to understand, actually. The term is idiocracy. So are we living in an equity or a communism or a idiocracy? What are we living in here?
Well, idiocracy is the gateway drug that leads to communism. Most people who are suffering from the condition of free thinking, they look at their view of communism rather than the improved narrative on communism. And they think ill thoughts about it. They don't think highly of it. They look at evidence and historical records, and they jump to the unapproved conclusion that communism not only doesn't work, but it's dangerous. So naturally, we have to get them thinking otherwise. So getting people to disconnect from their prefrontal cortex, behave like idiots, it puts them in a very empowering position of being disempowered. Therefore, they have to rely on big government and big corporations, not only telling them, but also demanding to them how they live their lives. So idiocracy, it's a therapeutic medicine, I like to say.
You know, there's something that I've been thinking about lately that is, I'm finding
Again, that's dangerous. Stop right there. Stop thinking about it.
It's this thing called reality. And I mean, it's challenging sometimes to face reality. So I can imagine why you might want to engage in some of these adventures.
Reality is misinformation. It's potentially part of the Russian collusion hoax. But reality believers, they are all bigoted morons. Rather than believing in racist reality, it's much better to base your objective reality on someone else's imagination. It's going to be way more inclusive, way more equitable, and way more diverse. So the idea that men can get pregnant, it's not part of reality, but it should be part of one's imagination that they believe is reality.
I think I'm going to invite the kind of sincere JP out of the persona here at this moment. What you just said actually makes a weird kind of sense. And I mean that seriously, right? Not facing reality does lead to all those things in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, and first, thank you for letting me have an exorcism and get out of this demented character. But man, trying to deny reality, I mean, talk about insanity, trying to do something that is just impossible to do. I think we can relate to reality and accept it, and maybe we see some things that need to be improved and we work on improving that. But when we look at reality and try to gaslight ourselves out of it, try to deny reality, it literally makes us insane, because reality is a force of nature that no human being, no matter how narcissistic they are, they cannot overpower reality. Yet, with so much of the propaganda out there, so much of the wokeness, so much of the corrupt agendas, they're trying to convince people to not believe in reality anymore, instead believe in the narrative. And in my opinion, that's very dangerous. And unfortunately, it works on some people.
Were you always, so to speak, awake? I won't use the term woke. Or was there some moment that suddenly you started to see through the matrix, as some people call it? And I think actually in this new film by Mickey Willis, The Great Awakening, sort of seeing through the matrix, waking up. What happened?
Well, I won't pretend like I've always been awake, and I won't pretend like I am awake. I think it's a journey, not a destination. So I still have a lot of waking up to do, certainly. But, back in 2000, so 23 years ago, I started living without a TV. So at the time, I understood. I watched a documentary by Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent, and in it he shows how all of the mainstream media outlets are controlled by very few at the top. So I understood, what we see on the news is propaganda, and also with one of the life principles that nothing is as it seems. It's been since about 2000 that I've been in my wake up phase. But I would say there was a major awakening for me in the spring of 2020. The pandemic is in full force, and I start to see like, okay, something's not making sense here. Goalposts are moving. There's just something's not right. And I start to realize, well, I don't think this is about a virus. So I'm looking into it, looking through lies and deception. And then shortly thereafter, I realized our freedoms are being eroded. And I know a little bit about history, so I know, okay, we're in a pattern. Humans have been here before, and learning from history, we can see where this pattern will go with freedom erosions if we allow it to. And that woke me up to realize freedom is my number one value. I didn't know it before. I'm not proud to say it, but it's true, so I'll be honest. I was entitled. I was ignorant. I took freedom for granted. Easy to do when you're born in America, actually, and I did it. And at that time, actually, April 7th, 2020, that's the day I found out my wife was pregnant with our first son. That itself woke something else up inside of me where I realized, okay, our freedoms are being eroded. Freedom is now a political issue in the United States, for crying out loud. I don't know how that happens. I thought we were born from freedom. Like, that's what America stands for. Spring of 2020, not anymore. So I realized, okay, I've got a son coming into this world. I've lived a good life. I hope it's much longer, but I've been gifted with a good life, bathing in freedom. So I realized there's a conversation where that I'm never willing to have with my son one day, where I have to try to explain to him what freedom was, and also why his father didn't do anything about it while he had a chance. So that spring of 2020, it certainly woke me up to a lot of what's going on in the world, and the agendas and the propaganda, the narrative, the brainwashing. But it also changed the nature of my work to basically use the language of comedy to speak up for freedom, help awaken other people to how darn important it is, and also help awaken people to see through the lies, hypocrisy, and corruption that was being spoon-fed to them.
I want to sort of validate that this is very much a journey. I mean, I think back to, I think it's 2015 for me, where I already had kind of been red-pilled on the Chinese Communist Party, so to speak, and the realities, and I knew what we were seeing in the media around that was false. And of course, there's good explanations as to why. Reduced access if you don't follow the party line, etc. There are many things. But what I didn't expect was, the Trump candidacy, the media suddenly getting into lockstep against him for some weird reason. That was a kind of really eye-opening for me. One kind of step forward. What's happening here? Trying to understand it. 2020, similar situation. We knew that there was something wrong about how basically the virus origins were being described. I'm a evolutionary biologist background. I knew what they were saying was preposterous. We did a whole documentary on this, kind of explained what was preposterous, so to speak. And then, wow, did we ever feel the weight of the system, right? But at the same time, I wasn't really clear on, for example, this thousandfold difference between the young people and old people being affected by the virus, right? And that only came months later. It's because you can only focus on so many things at once. So it's this kind of journey, right? Bobby Kennedy said to me once, and I think he says this repeatedly, there's no pandemic exception for the Constitution, or something to this vein. And you actually, you appear briefly in his real Anthony Fauci film, the film based on his book. And I noticed you've been appearing in a number of films, these kind of JP cameos. And how is that all happening?
Well, first off, it's an honor. And I'll say, there's two films that are just some of the most important films we'll ever see. The real Anthony Fauci movie, which, by the way, currently you can watch it for free at therealanthonyfaucimovie.com. It is phenomenal. It's engaging. It's exquisite. It shares so much wisdom, shines so much light. It's incredible. And then Pandemic 3, The Great Awakening. So it's a good place. How the heck does a weird redheaded comedian get involved in these monumental humanity saving projects like this? First off, I would say, I don't know. But the second answer is, it's an honor. And what I'm finding, when I meet people like Bobby Kennedy, when I meet people like Mickey Willis, the filmmaker of The Great Awakening, what we have in common is shared values and a shared mission. And what I've found, like the frontline doctors, all these people who I look up to, and I'm like, these are the heroes. And they meet me and they're very excited to meet me. And I'm like, well, dude, I'm just doing comedy. But you're changing the world. But what I find is we're sharing a mission. And what I've learned is, whether it's a comedian like me, a musician like High Rez the rapper, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Mickey Willis, we're all playing the same song, but we're just different instruments in the same orchestra playing the same song. So I've found it's just been a very beautiful symbiosis to be able to integrate, be a part of, and support great works that have a very serious, sincere message that is being brought forward. Professionally, it seems very different than what I do and what my background is, but there's just such a shared mission that's how I've been able to, I guess, be connected and I guess garner respect from these people that I would consider like the major heroes.
There's all these things that I hadn't sat down and thought to myself, what is the deeper meaning of this? Comedy is one of them, right? Because part of the impact of these last however many years and these, increasing wokeness is you're not allowed to be funny, right? It's just kind of a weird thing. Anything that you would traditionally find funny is actually a triggering, right? Or offensive or something like that. But part of it, I realized though, like seriously, actually just sitting down to think about it, is comedy really is truth telling, right? It's shining the light on things that we're not even supposed to talk about, but actually do need to be talked about. So I actually think there's a really important role to be played here, JP. I think you're selling yourself short a bit here.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do agree with it. The most important principle in comedy is the truth principle. Society in general, the mainstream, they're against comedy. They're against laughing. What they're really against is truth. Truth that violates the engineered narrative that they have. So in order to make someone laugh, a joke or a skit, it has to be based on some kind of truth. Otherwise, it doesn't connect with people. And if it doesn't connect with people, they won't have the emotional response of laughing. That's just a response that comes from having something connected to within you. So in the orchestra that's happening right now, and like you're in that orchestra and it's amazing, but for the instrument of comedy in the orchestra, it has a unique purpose, just like all the other instruments. And one of the purposes of comedy is it can convey a truth, and basically in the language of playfulness. Otherwise, if a message is just coming into someone's mind, oftentimes they'll reject that message before it even penetrates to be considered, because our minds just want to maintain homeostasis, keep our psychological center of gravity in check. Like we just want things to stay the same, including our own belief systems. But if you can get a message through with comedy, it can go into the mind, not to brainwash people, but to actually get it in so they can consider, what's in this? Is there something I want to think about differently right now? So comedy, it's a much less threatening, or it's perceived, I think, as a much less threatening way of communicating.
To validate your point, I'm going to roll that clip you had on Instagram of the communism works like a charm 100% of the time. Let's just roll that for a moment.
You know how there's some bad apples out there who get the reputation for only caring about money? Yes, our investment groups aren't solely focused on money. I mean, with their business strategies that they require us to implement, they're not going after money because they know there's more important things in life than money. Like what? Communism. Oh, I hear that's a very successful method of governing. Yeah, it works like a charm 100% of the time. And you see, for communism, you have to divide people into two classes, the rich and the poor. And so what our investment groups do is force businesses to implement ESG and DEI initiatives that'll cause the public to boycott them so that eventually those businesses are destroyed. And then hundreds of thousands of their workers become unemployed, which helps grow the population of poor people. Like communism isn't just going to implement itself.
So that really made me laugh. I was preparing for this interview and I thought, oh my goodness, how perfect. It's like almost my favorite topic too, right? So listen, let me tell you something. The other day we were at the Memorial Day parade here in Washington, D.C., and I met Felix Rodriguez, the man who captured Che Guevara, okay? And no, exactly. I was like, my God, it's Felix Rodriguez, right? And I just thought to myself, my goodness, there's so many people who think, that Che Guevara was some kind of emancipatory figure and wear his shirt and might even look down on Felix, right? As some kind of weird spook, who did something wrong. So many things have been kind of turned upside down. I don't know your thoughts on this.
Well, Stockholm Syndrome is the first thing that comes to my mind. A communist leader, a communist dictator, they're committing atrocities. They're literally committing crimes against humanity. And how do they get people to cheer for them? How do they get people to say, hey, give me some of that, more of that, let's support him? I think, first off, lies and deception is part of how these people who deserve absolutely no fan base, it's part of how they build it and come to power. But also, the classic Stockholm Syndrome scenario where people become bonded with their abusers and they'll actually try to protect the people that are harming them. So that Stockholm Syndrome, in my opinion, it helps explain why very harmful people can be revered at times.
See, I can understand that when I think, for example, of Mao or Stalin and Lenin and so forth. There's these cults around this person. But someone like Che Guevara, I expect most of the cult around Che Guevara is international somehow, right? And worn on, every rebellious youth's T-shirt, or so to speak, and perhaps every non-rebellious youth's T-shirt. I don't know.
Yeah, it's crazy. And in my opinion, it's a little bit scary. I remember a number of years ago, I was at a coffee shop in Berkeley, California, and they had images of him all over. They were selling shirts with him. And at the time, I knew nothing. I didn't really know who that guy is or what he stood for. But to me, it's a little bit of a scary thing to realize that people can look at a dangerous communistic person like him and think he's a cool symbol. So it's a little bit scary. And in my opinion, that's why the minds of youth are so important to protect. We know there's a lot of propaganda, communist subversion to get people on board without really knowing what they're getting on board for.
Well, absolutely. So, this is an obvious way to talk about the Great Awakening, where the focus of the film seems to be explaining that the thing that binds all these different madnesses of our time is actually communism and a sort of a communist ideology having kind of percolated into many different aspects of society. And I guess, is this the reason you find this film so monumental, or what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, that would be true. So Plandemic 3, The Great Awakening, you definitely got to see it. I believe it's viewable now at the plandemicseries.com. I believe so. If not, you'll find it easily. I look at all the problems we have going on, specifically in America, and there's countless problems, and there's big ones: pharmaceutical industries, corruption within our own government, mandates. I'm concerned with all those problems, but I believe at the heart of all those problems, the biggest problem I see that's causing so many of the other problems is the communist subversion that's been taking place in our country for decades. People don't even see it. And that's why the Great Awakening, man, it just masterfully paralleled what's going on in our country, what has been going on, and parallels it with these communist regimes that came in and took over, like Maoism in China. So I think communism, as weird as it sounds to say, I do believe communism is the biggest threat we have as a country. And therefore, shining the light of awareness on it and also giving solutions like The Great Awakening does, I think it's one of the greatest services that a film could do.
Well, and so let's jump to the real Anthony Fauci now. You also see this as a, as you said, I think a masterful film, something you're very proud of. So what is it you feel that in there is so particularly important?
Well, there's so many nuances that are exposed that are important. I mean, Gates, Fauci, but the bigger picture of what I see as important is it exposed the corrupt structures that are in place, federal agencies that have been corporately captured, agendas, money motivation is certainly a part of it, doesn't seem to be the whole thing, but the film masterfully exposed the structures that are in place. Because we could say, well, Fauci's not in his position anymore, so we're good. Like, no. Like, he was just a figurehead in a corrupt structure. So for too many years, we have given our power away to corrupt structures that don't have our best interest in mind, at least some of the time. So that's our fault. We have given our power away, and it's mostly been a lack of awareness about what's going on. We've fallen for the deception, but either way, we have to realize it's our fault. And if we don't admit that, we'll never improve. So the film helps us see how we got into this mess. Yeah, it's our fault, but more importantly, now that we can see it, like, you can't get out of a jail you don't know you're in. The film illuminates the jail of deception and corruption of these structures that we've been in so that we can reclaim our power. It's hard to not be a victim of deception if you can't see the deception. So in my opinion, the real Anthony Fauci movie, it helps us reclaim our power. So history doesn't have to keep repeating itself because we're learning from history. We're seeing the jail that we've been in.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, JP, I think we're going to finish up. Any final thoughts?
I would just say thank you for having me, and I so appreciate the work you do. And it's just, I know we've met briefly in person before, but it's great to have a few minutes to sit down face to face with you.
I love it, and I think we definitely need you have on for longer, proper American thought leaders one of these days.
I'd love that. I'd be honored.